Hello, this is Shani Pierre. I'm the director of the Maison at Columbia University. And I'd like to welcome all of you today for this conversation with Véronique Tadjo about her book In the Company of Men, which is just coming out in a couple of months in English translation with the other press. Véronique Tadjo will be in conversation with Madeleine Dobie, who is my wonderful colleague and professor and chair of the French department here at Columbia University. There will be some time for, well, I wanted to mention, first of all, that there are several other co-sponsors along with the Maison Française of this event, and just to thank those co-sponsors who are the Center for Science and Society, the Department of History, Institute of African Studies, the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, the Society of Fellows and Heyman Center for the Humanities, and the other press. So thank you to all of our co-sponsors. Thank you to Véronique and Madeleine for joining us. For those of you who might have a question, you can add a question at any point in the chat box at the bottom of the screen. I think that's all I wanted to say in the guise of introduction. So I will turn over to Madeleine Dobie. Thank you.
Thank you, Shani. Welcome again to the Columbia University Maison Française for this conversation with writer, academic, artist, book illustrator, Véronique Tadjo. Thank you to the Maison Française, to our wonderful director, Shani Pierre, and our program coordinator, Fanny Gay, for all of their help with organizing this event. Today's conversation is being held in conjunction with a course on pandemics in Francophone literature and history that I'm co-teaching with Professor Thomas Dodman. And the last text on our syllabus is Véronique Tadjo's most recent novel, En compagnie des hommes, which explores Ebola virus disease and the social and environmental contexts in which it has emerged as a threat to public health. But before I say a little bit more about this novel, I'd like to say a couple of words to introduce Véronique Tadjo, even though I suspect that many of you are already familiar with her really rich and important body of work that includes novels, poetry, plays, literature for children and adolescents. If you've read anything by Véronique, you know that she has a unique literary voice that is arrestingly lyrical and very intimate, but at the same time engaged with the central social and political questions of our times. I think of her novel L'ombre d'Imana, The Shadow of Imana from 2000, which explores the aftermath and the memory of the genocide in Rwanda. I think of Loin de mon père, Far from my father from 2010, which examines political conflict in Côte d'Ivoire. Véronique Tadjo's books have won many prizes, including the Grand Prix littéraire d'Afrique Noire in 2005 for Reine Pokou, or Queen Pokou, and the Bernard Dadier National Grand Prize for Literature in 2016 for Nelson Mandela, Non à l'apartheid. So Nelson Mandela, no to apartheid. Véronique Tadjo's novels are distinctive in lots of ways, one being that they are set in many different locations, reflecting her own experience of living, studying, teaching on 3 continents at least, and in several different African nations, including Ivory Coast, the country of her family, her childhood, Mali, Nigeria, and South Africa, where she chaired the French Studies program at the University of Witwatersrand. And today she's joining our virtual conversation from London. Véronique, thank you so much for being here to speak about En compagnie des hommes. This novel was published by Don Quixote in 2017, and it's about to come out in a really outstanding, beautiful English translation by John Cullen, which will be published in the US by the Other Press and in the UK by Hope Road under the title In the Company of Men, The Ebola Tales. And as I mentioned very briefly before, and I know we're going to get into this during our conversation, this is a book that explores Ebola in its social, political, and environmental context, how it emerged, how it has become a threat to human health. It's obviously, speaking today, a very timely work that invites us to rethink, to return to Ebola in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. So maybe let me start by asking you just simply, when and why did you start thinking about writing about Ebola? I know the novel is dedicated to the victims of the Ebola outbreak that occurred in Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia between 2014 and 2016.
Well, thank you very much, Madeleine, and thank you to Chanticleer as well. And thank you to the Maison Française for having me today. Yes, I think to answer your question, the book developed over time. In fact, I was in South Africa when in December 2013. Yeah, no, yes, I heard about yes, it was the end of 2013. I heard about this mysterious disease that was happening in Guinea. But I must say I did not take any, I didn't give any attention to it just because it was the end of the year. And in South Africa, the academic year ends in December. So as the head of the French department, I was busy with all sorts of administrative duties and marking papers. Well, I didn't pay attention. And then I went to Abidjan over the holidays, the Christmas holidays, and everything was fine. But we had started talking about this disease, but nothing much was known about it. So anyway, again, everything seemed normal. So I went back to, by the time I went back to South Africa, it had been identified as the Ebola disease. And it was the first time that I heard about it. And from that time on, I started really paying great attention to what was happening. And in a matter of months, it had evolved and entered. So it started in Guinea, but then it had entered Liberia and then Sierra Leone. And what probably triggered my attention particularly was the fact that Côte d'Ivoire has the same border with Guinea. So there's a lot of cultural links and commercial links. And I mean, everybody thought that the disease could come to Côte d'Ivoire anytime. And as a matter of fact, when several months later, I went back to Côte d'Ivoire, the atmosphere had changed entirely. I mean, people were not shaking hands anymore. You know how in the Francophone world, you're always kissing both cheeks and all that was over, and there were, you know, chlorine solutions in front of every building, public building, and it was really, you had messages from the presidency saying how much you need to be careful. So I remember wanting to see, I had been told that there was an Ebola center that had been built just as a prevention measure. And I wanted to see it, so I went to the Hôpital de Trècheville, and there it was brand new, and luckily it was not used, but I remember this huge tree casting its shade over that Ebola center, which is probably what much later on, when I would start really writing, I would use the baobab as a symbol of the great observer. But it took me one event that also, one thing that also made me continue with this research on the disease was when I was invited as a visiting professor at Rutgers University at the French department. And then I was kind of suddenly plunged into a mediatic a storm, if you want, because by that time the epidemic had taken hold of the three countries, and there was a lot of information, and the whole world had started being really scared about the possibility of a pandemic. So I gathered a lot of material, and also there were conferences happening, and there was a conference in particular I attended at Rutgers University, which gave me more information. But in the end, it was only about a year after the end of the epidemic that I sat down to write. And by that time, I had a lot of research and a lot of material.
I think anyone could tell that you did a lot of research, because the novel really situates Ebola at the center of this web of human and environmental connections. You explore the social context, some dimensions of the political context, certainly economic questions, the relationship to globalization, to extractive capitalism. And so ecological questions, climate change. Can you speak a little bit about that decision to approach Ebola in that context of all of these different connections and causal factors, some social, some economic, some environmental?
Yes, I think first I wasn't very happy about the way the story had been told. I relied a lot on the media, but at the same time, I thought that it was kind of not how I wanted to understand what was happening. And having been brought up in Côte d'Ivoire, having lived in Côte d'Ivoire, I knew that there was much more to say about what was happening what had happened in these three countries with this Ebola disease. And also I was extremely shocked by the fact that Ebola had been given an identity, a national identity. It was like Ebola belonged to Africa. It was like, and suddenly Africa had become again the heart of darkness, where the worst can happen. And I knew it wasn't that story. So I started digging and digging more and more. And the more I kind of understood what was happening, the more I realized that, in fact, it was extremely connected to our relationship with the environment, and to as a human race, the way we interacted with non-human creatures and the fauna and flora and the environment. And so I wanted to show the complexity of the story, as opposed to this kind of simplistic way of telling how the disease evolved. I wanted to talk about a human story, how we behave when we're faced with the threat of extinction, and how it can bring the best of us or the worst of us. And yes, a very yes, and this idea that, look, the virus doesn't belong to anybody. We have to be prepared for probably over pandemics or over epidemics, and I think I was very aware of that.
I would like to ask a follow-up question, but let me just first say to everyone who's attending, who's listening, that if you in a few minutes we'll have some time for you to ask questions of Véronique Tadjo. So if you have a question at any point, please write it in the chat, and then we can get to your questions in a couple of minutes. So just to go back to what you were saying, Véronique, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the kind of moral and political thinking that is going on in this book. It's hard to pin down, I think, because I hope we'll talk about this in a minute. There are a lot of different voices speaking, but but it's certainly, you know, it's a novel that's very, you know, critical of you know, unbridled human greed and indifference to the natural world. In a broader sense, there's criticism of human arrogance, our belief that we can find a solution to every problem that, you know, we create. That the novel alludes to political corruption, to endemic warfare, to capitalism in its worst forms, to globalization. At one point, I think the virus itself, Ebola, speaks at a certain point in the novel and says that it would prefer minimal government. But I think perhaps the virus is not a very reliable narrator, and other narrators cast some moral doubt on the virus. So I'm just wondering what kind of ethical and political thinking or rethinking you wanted to inspire. Do you think of this as a work, I don't know, I feel like I'm going to use these academic types of terms here, but as an anti-humanist, post-humanist? It seems to push back a little bit against the whole idea of the Anthropocene. I'm thinking a little bit about our colleague Gayatri Spivak's notion of the planetary, so that humans should, you know, think on the scale of the planetary. Anyway, so I'm just curious as to, you know, how you're thinking about resetting that kind of moral and political thinking.
Yes. First, I have to say that I chose to make everybody talk, to have everybody, to give everybody a point of view. That's why the baobab is the observer, is the one who tells the story, in fact, and invite people to talk and express themselves. Then you have the man, of course, the human beings, and then you have the bat, the virus, who also talks. But this is because I wanted to give different points of view, and I think that it's not that. I think the baobab, who is supposed to be the everlasting force, if you want, is loves human beings, and he's the most, if you want, the most neutral, not neutral voice, but sympathetic voice. I think he loves human beings. He has a faith in human, the human force, if you want, and he is ready to be. He's sorry for what is happening in the human world. The one who is the second voice, who is trying to find some balance, is the bat, because as you know, a bat has that feeling of being a hybrid type of animal. So it's about the diversity and the multiplicity of nature. This idea of saying that survival is in diversity, in multiplicity, in the capacity to adapt, and not to have this straight jacket. This idea that there's something pure somewhere. There's only one thing. There's always, nature shows us that there's a multiplicity everywhere. So that is the key to survival. And the virus, of course, is the kind of an anarchist, you know. You would expect that of him, you know, in the sense that he sees that men with a capital M are the first actors of their own downfall, and that it's only, he says it's only when you're together, when you find solidarity between yourself, that you are going to defeat me. But extreme individualism is going to let me win this war, and that's mainly. I mean, I'm not framing. I'm framing it in the simple way, as simply as possible. That's the idea. The idea is that, in fact, human beings have the solution to their own problems, in the sense that it's only through unity that we can defeat something as devastating as a pandemic or an epidemic. And by the way, I want to say that each epidemic within one country is kind of a pandemic. That means if you look at a world, a closed world, within the borders of a particular country, it's like the end of the world. So it's also, you know, it's just when it becomes so big that it becomes a pandemic. But each epidemic is something that is terrible within a particular world.
I think one of the things that is very interesting about the novel is, I'm picking up here a little bit on what you just said about science, is that it's there's an affirmation of science, you know, of medicine, of science, of public health measures, of scientific understanding and solutions, but at the same time set in a context of caution about human overreach, about human arrogance, and concern about exploitation of the environment. So I think you managed to balance those two things really well in the novel. But I want to come back to the bat, because as you were just explaining, there are a lot of different witnesses who speak in the novel. So there are human witnesses, doctors, nurses, people who've survived Ebola, people who've lost loved ones to Ebola. And then there's a section, well, there are a couple of places in the text where non-human actors speak. So the virus speaks, the baobab tree speaks, as you mentioned, and the bat. And so the bat is, you know, describes itself as a hybrid, you know, and you tell this wonderful story that you quote from the great Malian writer, ethnologue, Amadou Hampâté Bâ. Can you tell us a little bit about that story? And there are a couple of texts actually that you include in the novel, songs and so forth. Maybe you could tell us about the decision to include quotations from those works, and maybe particularly that tale.
I think that the tale from Hampâté Bâ, Amadou Hampâté Bâ, was for me an acknowledgement of the inspiration that oral tradition was for me when I was writing. It's just African oral tradition helps you, frees you from the different literary genres. Because when you look at the story, a storyteller, a traditional storyteller, that person is going to use poetry, history, whatever is available. And the storyteller is by definition someone who can adapt himself or herself to a new public, a new audience. So if you take one one tale, for example, and you follow it through the ages and the way people have been retelling that same tale, you will find out that the oral tradition is not fixed, it is evolutive. So it allows you to adapt to a new audience. And that's what I like particularly about that genre, because I was able to then take songs, poetry, stories, and also I was able to use testimonies and also scientific facts at times when it was, for example, a doctor speaking. And that's kind of freedom, I think, is absolutely wonderful. And that's why within that literary context, you can also invite animals to speak. And I would like to say, by the way, that other people have done it through the literary history. The first thing that comes to mind is, of course, Les Fables de La Fontaine, which is then you also have you also have even mythology in Greek mythology, or even Yoga mythology, or even so many texts where you use the animals, the animal figure has been used to express human traits sometimes. So I come from different literary traditions, and I borrow from them with a lot of happiness.
Yes, it really, it feels that the work itself feels hybrid in that sense, that you are drawing on different literary traditions, oral traditions, written traditions, and scientific literature as well. And I think one of the really distinctive qualities of this work is the way that you're able to integrate an oral tale about the origin of the bat and its hybridity as the child of the fox and the dove. How that fits in quite seamlessly, actually, with some writing that is very factual, very informative. You tell people a lot about Ebola, about medical protocols.
Yes, because I learned a lot, and I wanted to also transmit that, to pass on what I had learned through my research, because I think it was an amazing experience to be taking on so much knowledge, and it almost changed my perspective on life, and also it's because I'm very interested in the finding some sort of complementarity between the humanities and science, and as you know, this is developing more and more. But in my head, there was also the fact that I wanted the readers to come out of the book with some information. But apart from that, I wanted them to be touched by the story, and to not just see it on a cerebral level, but also on some emotional level. That's why that I wanted to, I have used that hybrid literary genre, which for me is familiar to everybody, because in our mind, there's always that storytelling tradition, and that one is ageless and goes, it's also ageless and borderless. So I thought that would be one way to take the reader with me.
You're absolutely right that this hybrid, to go there again, between medicine and literature is very much of our time, of our moment. In fact, at Columbia, we're just launching a new major in medicine and literature, and some of our students are in the course are in that major or will be in that major. So it's really timely. I have quite a few more questions for you, but I see that a couple of questions have come into the chat from other people listening. So maybe I'll turn to those questions and yes, and encourage anyone else who wants to ask a question to put it in the chat now. So so there's a question from Irene or Irene Bernstein Peshmez. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that very badly and I apologize. But Irene or Irene's question is, how would you evaluate the reaction and treatment of the COVID pandemic in the US compared to with the way that the Ebola pandemic was handled in Africa?
Oh, it's totally different. In the Ebola epidemic, it was only eradicated when there was this solidarity at I could say at such a large scale that had not probably been seen before that period. So it was the coming of many acts of solidarity that managed to control the epidemic. So in that sense, it was an example of global solidarity. Even though you have a lot of things to say also, you can say that it came very late. A lot of people could have been saved if it had arrived earlier. You can talk about all the kind of geopolitical forces at play. You can say a lot of things, but at the end of the day, it was global solidarity. Today, I feel that it's more within the confines of borders. That when you look at Europe, you look at the United States, you look at other countries, even Africa, it's all, it seems that the leaders are looking within the borders of their own countries. So that idea of solidarity has not come yet to a level that could help to finish with that horrible disaster sooner. And also, I think that within the country, the solidarity is not there. You see, because within the different countries, but because you asked me about the United States, I think that the solidarity is not there yet, in the sense that you have too much division about how to handle this virus and the different inequalities in the society that are creating tensions and preventing maybe the kind of merging of energy towards the same goal.
Obviously, the production of a vaccine or several vaccine candidates has been very fast in the context of COVID-19. So even if it doesn't always feel as though there's been a great deal of solidarity, there has been, resources have been devoted to this. Do you feel that in the case of Ebola, that was slower to happen, and that it was only when it seemed as though it was going to overspill the West African region that an international effort became serious?
Yes, to a certain extent, because previously the Ebola epidemics had happened in DRC, Republic Democratic of Congo, where they were kind of at a low level, in the sense that you had maybe I don't know, it was in a village, it was like in remote rural areas, and people died, but it didn't affect the rest of the world, if you want, in a sense. But it's only when it moved to the cities, and it moved to 3 countries at the same time, that people realized the magnitude of the problem. And also when, traveling by plane, by road, by train, increased the contagion, then it became really a world concern. That and as you know, or as you will remember, there were some cases in the United States when people returning from Ebola stricken countries went back to the United States, and then they infected the nurses. So it was like looking like it was going to be out of control, and then really the whole world decided to really put all of the their efforts together.
Yes, and one of the witnesses who speaks in the novel is an American doctor who who was infected with Ebola and then treated in the US.
Yes, exactly. It's just it's a strange. It's such a complex story, because at the same time you have this amazing person who goes to a place where there is great danger for his life, manages to save lives, and at the same time, when he's repatriated to the United States to be attended to be treated, you realize the immense inequality of treatment between the the countries which have all the equipment and the technology and the know-how, and countries where people have hospitals are neglected. There's not enough of anything, of everything, and it's very difficult to understand it to its full extent, because there's so many contradictions and so many at the same time warm ideas about human beings, and at the same time some cold 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 facts.
Yes, the novel really shows it's you don't look away from the bad things, from the neglect, the abandonment, the harshness, sometimes perhaps a necessary harshness, but you also talk about the solidarity, the compassion, the people who intervene in spite of very significant danger to themselves. So you really balance those things out well, I think, in the novel. So I'm looking at a couple of more questions from Thomas Dodman, my colleague, and co-teacher of our course on pandemics. So Thomas's first question is, he asks if you could speak a little bit about the role of children in the novel. There are a lot of references to children, speakers who are children. How did you think about that?
I think that children suffered a lot during the Ebola epidemic, because strangely enough, unlike the COVID-19 pandemic, the young children were most at risk. Their immune system wasn't ready to take on such a massive attack from the virus. So a lot of children died, and a lot of women also were victims of the disease, because they tended to stay with the sick. They tended to wait until they sought treatment for themselves. So I think also, if we go back to the children, there were lots of orphans, and there are still, of course, orphans from the Ebola epidemic, and there is something heart-wrenching about a child who has lost both his parents from the disease, and must be bearing traumatic, a very traumatic memory of what has happened. So they're kind of reminder of what is what has happened, and is for them, and for, of course, for the future, that we need to not only remember but make sure that we don't do the same mistake, and prepare the future for them.
Are there programs to help the Ebola orphans? Are there particular institutional arrangements, or are you familiar with that?
Yes, in fact, there are, and that is one thing that struck me about the Ebola epidemic, is that the media attention was intensive while the epidemic lasted, but once it was eradicated, it was like you didn't hear about it anymore. It was like silence. And I was struck by that, because a lot of things are still happening. I mean, programs, as you said, to help the orphans from the, who have lost their parents to the epidemic, and also the aftermath of the infection. As we know it today, for example, we call it the long COVID. The long COVID, which is that all the after effects of the disease. So there's a lot of people who need constant treatment, medical treatment and attention, because they have survived, yes, but they carry the if you want, the scars of the virus. So there's a lot of things happening, and also it's because of what has happened after the epidemic that, in a way, Africa was helped during this COVID-19 pandemic, because there's been a lot of awareness of possible further epidemics, and kind of explaining to people that this is something that could happen, and this is after a lot of previous epidemics have happened. So there's a lot of work that has gone on after the epidemic, and I wanted to talk about that as well.
So Thomas had another question, which is also something that I was wondering about, which is your inspiration. So are there other novels about epidemics that you read, that inspired you when you were thinking about how you would approach writing about Ebola?
You wouldn't be surprised to hear that The Plague by Albert Camus was a big inspiration. In fact, at the beginning, I thought that I would do a rewriting of The Plague, and then I thought, no, that due to the context, and there were too many other things that I wanted to say. So, but it was one of the books that I read passionately, reread, because I've always liked the book. And of course, there's this narrative of the Plague of London, and there's been lots of literature also, but more like thrillers, like The Zone. It's more like in the thriller category, although it's based on science. No, I read quite a lot of non-fiction as well, of course, because there were lots of writing by scientists.
It's interesting. I think obviously the La Peste is incontournable in this context, but at the same time, your book is very different. It's the central characters of that novel are, it's a group of white men in a colonial context that they, is barely made visible, and the plague is really treated as this, human moral problem, and not so much as a political or an economic or an environmental problem. Did you think about those differences in your approach?
But I've heard people say that it's an allegory for the World War II, for Nazism. So it's you can read a novel in different. In fact, novels evolve with different contexts. We read them. When I reread The Plague, I was like in another intellectual mind because of the Ebola epidemic. So you read novels in different ways during different periods.
Yes, I think a lot of people have said that they're reading Camus very differently at the moment, that they used to read Camus more as an allegory of the occupation and decisions about collaboration and resistance. And now people have become much more interested in the medical and health, a literal level of the novel.
Yes.
So I have a question from Judith Gorevich, someone you know quite well, I think, since she is the publisher of the Other Press. And Judith's question is, do you think that African countries that dealt with Ebola are now being listened to as authorities in the context of the present pandemic?
I wouldn't say that. But what I would say is that they have learned a lot. I mean, I think that they were lucky that the disease arrived a bit later than in Europe and in the United States. So they had the opportunity to see what was happening. But the WHO, the World Health Organization, was quick to put the whole measures in place immediately, because having learned from the Ebola epidemic, immediately, like, borders were closed, the former health measures that I talked about earlier, this, washing of hands and being careful in the public spaces, and trying even to have a social distanciation, which was a political problem because, of course, with poverty, it's difficult to have social distance when you're living so close to one another in small places. So I think that it's just that they were, you could say, over cautious, because Ebola happened only a few years ago, so it was still in everybody's mind. So they probably went more overdrive than anything else. But in Western countries, when was the last time? The last big epidemic was, I suppose, SARS, but it didn't do as much damage as COVID. So people are not quite used to these drastic health measures that curtail liberties a lot.
Right. And I think that now we're about to experience something that hasn't happened in the US since polio, which is a mass vaccination campaign, even though in African countries that's something very familiar.
Exactly. That is the big difference as well. Although there's some resistance, especially the resistance comes from bad memories of colonial times, when there were lots of experiments made on populations regarding the eradication of certain diseases and vaccination campaigns. But people are used to, are more used to that, whereas we see that there's more resistance in the Western world.
I feel that in the novel, there's certainly criticism of governments, of people who control, administrative, health, health infrastructures and so forth in the countries that were afflicted by Ebola. You don't, I think, very much directly indict colonialism, though it's in the background. And I wonder if you were thinking about that, or if there was a deliberate choice involved there.
No, I could have gone all the way to colonialism, but I was more interested in the system, the economic system adopted by now independent African countries, and how this choice of economic and political system has done more bad than good. And so that's why I was I'm still very hurt and revolted by some of the choices in terms of health, the health system, that we are still, after what we went through in West Africa with the Ebola epidemic, you'll find that we still, the infrastructures, the health infrastructures are still not, in my opinion, up to standard. And that I don't understand. I know that there are a lot of efforts being made towards a better health system, but in a general stance, it's not, in my opinion, it's still not ready for major incidents, major health issues, and I despair a bit, and that's why I didn't want to mince my words, and I wanted to be critical, because I think it's the question of life and death. And so we need to really be open about that. We need to say, okay, no, it's not good enough. We've got to continue our efforts. We can't have knee-jerk reactions. We've got to be prepared for the worst, and therefore we need to continue this effort towards a better health systems, and also better communications between all the countries. I think that is being done even as we speak, but one would like it to be faster, better, that sort of thing.
I think it's very interesting. It sounds as though you were a little bit concerned that if you went back too much into the history of, colonial exploitation and colonial medicine as well, that might deflect the responsibility from the present, and what needs to happen now, and what kinds of responses can be are possible.
Yes, I think that we made choices, and it's for us to be accountable to our choices, and so you can say what you want, but health is a priority, and we need to continue accepting that it is a priority, one of the big priorities, because when you lose it, when you fall into a crisis, health crisis, then everything else disappears. I mean, look at the school system, look at the educational system, how it has been disrupted by the pandemic. Look at the economy, how it has been disrupted by the pandemic. Everything, everywhere you look, it's been disrupted by the pandemic. Therefore, you can see that health and the management of health has to become a priority, because without it, it seems that the society cannot stay on its feet.
So I have a couple more questions here. The first is from Ellie Grabowski, who asks if you can explain the title of the novel.
Yes. In the company of man with a capital M, I specify that. It's because, in fact, I'm shifting the emphasis. It's the non-human who are watching the humans. I don't know if you, so in the company of man, is in fact, or we would say because the baobab is the central character, the one who sees everything. Therefore, he is in the company of man. Is to break that idea that the rest of the universe is dependent on us, whereas we are dependent on the rest of the universe. We are dependent. We are part of it, and we are all dependent on one another. And so that's why it's in the company of man. It's not the point of view of man as such, but when you observe man, what do you see? When you observe human being, what do you see? What can you say? What is, in a way, what is the opinion of the non-human regarding humans and their behavior?
So it's a title that pushes back against anthropocentrism.
Yeah. Well, it's just trying to say this. We are so connected that we cannot escape understanding that we are part of this planet and not the masters of it to the point of destruction. And also the acknowledgement that there are many things that we do not understand. Coming from a West African culture, this idea of invisibility, visibility, what is visible to the eye and what is happening at another level is also important to acknowledge. We cannot grasp everything, and therefore we need to be humble in a certain way and accept our vulnerability.
I was very struck by the fact that in scientific literature about epidemics, bats, for example, are always described as well hosts or vectors. But you talk about being a host, but you give it a whole different kind of meaning, and of course the bat has a voice and a certain kind of agency, and so you really shift the kind of thinking that we find in scientific writing about disease.
Yes, because we always, in a sense, that's what the bat is the symbol of. We're trying to find simple solutions. The bat is the host of the virus, therefore the bat has to, if possible, disappear, and the problem will disappear. But the truth is that we have to go further. We have to go beyond that and try and understand where the origin of the problem is. And very often we'll find that the origin of the problem is in us, because we have shrunk the territory of animals to the point where the cohabitation, the cohabitation is not healthy. Is not healthy, and some of the diseases that were left somewhere in the forest are coming to us because we were not supposed to be so close and so antagonistic.
Mm-hmm. So let me take a last question from the chat. This is from Robert Frenzel Berra, and probably also mispronouncing that, so I apologize. And Robert asks, have you reevaluated the book in light of the COVID pandemic. So you wrote it, it's all about a pandemic, it ends in a somewhat open-ended way, and then of course we have COVID. Have you rethought it or thought again about it in light of COVID?
What has happened is that I wrote the book, as I said, in 2017, and now there are these two, there's this translation into English, and it has been a very interesting involvement in looking at the text again and looking this translation, if you want, has given it another light in the view of the pandemic today. So somehow I myself have understood it better than previously, because there were things that I had sensed, but that somehow today the book, the text is talking to me in a different way. So this translation has given it definitely some actuality, something new that is very, I think, is very important today.
I'm glad you bring up the translation, because that was going to be my last question, and as I see we're running out of time, maybe I'll ask that. So, did you work with the translator at all, and were there any particular challenges, technical challenges that you and the translator encountered? It reads very beautifully, I think.
Yes, and I'm very happy with the translation. And you know, translation is also an interpretation. But what I liked about working on the translation, on the new translation, is the fact that it became more like a conversation between humans and non-humans. And it was all in this, in the way of making it more of a oral tale. The orality came more strongly in the translation, in the English translation, and that was something that almost surprised me. It was in the back of my mind, but it almost surprised me. But I understood how this orality was what made the difference.
Well, so thank you so much, Véronique, for spending this time talking about In the Company of Men, Ebola Tales. I encourage anyone who hasn't read it to either read it in French, or if your preferred language is in English, it will soon be available in this great translation. So look for that. And thank you again to the Maison Française. If those people who are on the Zoom meeting who are students in the pandemic course, if you could just stay on, you'll be invited to join a breakout room, and we'll have a little bit more privilege of a private conversation with Véronique. But for everyone else, this is the end of our public presentation. Thank you for attending. If you'd like to know more about events at the Maison Française and you're not on our email list, you can find that information on the website. So thank you very much.